Improper disassembly or reassembly of an actuator can cause serious injury. These tasks should be done only in strict compliance with the manufacturer's recommendations. Please continue to read the various cautions and warnings. Click Next to please read and acknowledge the warning above. After reading the warning, click Next to continue. The equipment listed above should be available during the maintenance procedure. After reviewing the required equipment, click Next to continue. The precautions listed above should be used before disassembling the actuator. After reviewing the precautions, click Next to continue. The first step to removing the AOV is to remove all of the air supply tubes from the positioner, regulator, and diaphragm casing. To do so safely, you first need to shut off the main air supply to the AOV. Click on the main air supply valve to close. Now that the stem is lowered, it is time to remove the regulator. Click Next to continue. With the air supply shut off and the internal pressure of the AOV bled off, remove all of the air supply tubes from the positioner, regulator, and diaphragm casing. Select the wrench from the tool bin and then click on each pair of end connectors to remove each tube. Repeat until all of the tubes have been removed. Next, to manually operate the AOV during the removal process, you need to attach a bypass air supply to the diaphragm casing. Note that the bypass air supply tube includes a manually operated regulator and pressure gauge. Select both the wrench and the bypass air supply tube from the tool bin, and then click on both the main air supply connector and the diaphragm casing connector to attach the bypass air supply tube. With the bypass air supply attached and the bypass regulator valve closed, next you need to open the main air supply valve. Click on the main air supply valve to open. Before removing the positioner, be sure to note or match mark the position of the feedback arm for consistency during reassembly. Click on the feedback arm. The next step is to remove the positioner from the yoke. To do this, remove the linkage between the positioner and the stem connector. Select the wrench from the tool bin. Using a wrench, remove the two mounting bolts holding the positioner frame to the yoke. Select the wrench from the tool bin and click on each of the mounting bolts to remove. The next step is to remove the regulator. Using a wrench, remove the two mounting bolts holding the regulator to the yoke. Select the wrench from. Now that the positioner, regulator, and their air tubes have been removed from the AOV, the remaining maintenance and inspection steps can either be conducted in the field, or in the case of a high radiation area, in the shop after removing the entire actuator assembly. Before attempting to disconnect the actuator from the valve, all of the pressure, the stored energy, needs to be removed from the spring inside the AOV. To be certain that there is sufficient room to loosen the spring adjuster, since the air pressure in the AOV is currently at atmospheric level, it is best to raise the travel indicator to mid-stroke. Click on the bypass control valve. To open it sufficiently to raise the travel indicator, use a wrench to loosen the spring adjuster to remove the stored energy. Select the wrench from the tool. Before the stem connector is removed, use the controllable bypass air supply to lower the valve stem to the closed position. This will safely lower the valve stem before lifting the yoke assembly from the valve. Click on the control supply valve to lower. Next, use a wrench to remove the stem connector, being careful not to damage the stem threads. Select the wrench from the tool bin and click on each of the. Now that the stem connector has been removed, the actuator stem and valve stem are no longer attached to each other and are ready to be separated. There are two methods for lifting the yoke assembly from the valve stem, depending on the circumstances. First, with the bypass air supply tube connected and the actuator stem raised, making a gap between the two stems. And second, with the bypass air supply tube removed and the actuator stem lowered and overlapping the valve stem. For this lesson, we will use the second method. Click Next. Before removing the yoke assembly from the valve, you'll need to remove the bypass air supply tube. To do so safely, you first need to shut off the main air supply to the AOV. With the main air supply shut off, remove the bypass air supply tube. Select the wrench from the tool bin and click on both bypass air supply connectors to remove. Next, be sure to check that both the yoke and the valve are match marked for accurate reassembly. Locate and click on the match mark to confirm. To remove the yoke lock nut, use a hammer and a brass rod to loosen it, and then remove it by hand. Select the hammer and brass rod from the tool bin and click on the yoke lock nut to loosen and remove. Please note, with the yoke lock nut loosened, make certain to stabilize the yoke assembly. Click Next. Now that everything is loose, firmly lift the yoke assembly straight up and away from the valve stem. Pay extra attention to the overlapping actuator and valve stems during the lift, making sure not to damage the thread. With the yoke assembly lifted from the valve stem, you can now transport it to a convenient location for the rest of the disassembly. Click Next. Now that you have safely transported the AOV assembly to the workshop bench, you may continue to disassemble the AOV. Click to completely remove the spring stored energy, turn the spring adjuster counterclockwise to remove. Select the wrench from the tool bin and click on the spring adjuster to remove. With the spring adjuster removed, you can now easily remove both the spring seat and the actuator spring. With the spring seat removed, you can now remove the actuator spring through the bottom of the yoke. Click on the actuator spring to remove it. With the spring removed, it is now safe to remove the upper diaphragm casing. Before removing any of the casing bolts, be sure to confirm that the upper and lower casings are match marked. To remove the upper casing, use a wrench to remove the casing bolts. Select the wrench from the tool bin and click on each of the casing bolts until they are all removed. With all the casing bolts removed, you can now remove the upper casing. Click on the upper casing to remove. With the upper casing removed, use a wrench to remove the top plate bolt. Select the wrench from the tool bin and click on the top plate bolt to remove it. Now you can freely lift the top diaphragm plate out of the casing. Click on the top diaphragm plate to remove it. Now you can freely lift the diaphragm out of the casing. Click on the diaphragm. Under the diaphragm is the bottom diaphragm plate, ready to be removed. Click on the bottom diaphragm plate to remove it. With the bottom diaphragm plate removed, you can now remove the actuator stem through the bottom of the yoke. Be sure to pull straight to have the stem slide smoothly out of the stem bushing. Click on the actuator stem to remove. Next, you need to remove the bottom casing. Before you start removing any of the casing bolts, be sure to match mark the lower casing with the yoke. To remove the bottom casing, remove each of the bottom casing bolts. Select the wrench from the tool bin, then click on each of the bottom casing bolts. Repeat to remove them all. With all of the bottom casing bolts removed, you can now remove the lower diaphragm casing. Click on the lower diaphragm casing. Once the bottom casing has been removed, the gasket is loose and easily removed. Click on the gasket to remove it. To remove the stem bushing, you first need to remove a small snap ring using a pair of pliers. Select the pliers from the tool bin and click on the snap ring to remove it. Since the stem bushing has a tight fit between the yoke and the stem, due to its O-rings, you will need to tap on the underside of the bushing to loosen and remove it. Select the hammer and brass rod from the tool bin and click on the stem bushing to loosen and remove it. Click Next to continue. Congratulations, you have completed this task. Click on the main menu to access the task list, the About page, or exit the application.